hangers in his closet.
I'm telling you, he was as low-key as they come, and shy and retiring. If you can visualize Meyer to be a shy and he was shy and retiring.
But when it came to doing business, Lansky could be just as ruthless as his murderous cronies. In 1931, Meyer helped his pal Lucky Luciano take over the New York mob. To do it, Lucky had to eliminate the two rival bosses at the time, Salvatore Maranzano and Joe the Boss Masseria. Lucky had no trouble bumping off Masseria, but Maranzano was a harder target. He trusted no one, especially not young Italian climbers like Luciano. That's where Lansky came in. Meyer's Jewish gunmen were the ones who turned up at Maranzano's office.
They were dispatched by Meyer Lansky. They said they were agents from the Treasury Department, and they were going to have to take a look at the books. And Mr. Maranzano came out, and Red Levine, very close to Meyer Lansky, was one of the gunmen who shot Maranzano. They also stabbed him, and they departed.
With the bloodshed over, Lucky Luciano was king of the hill, and standing beside the throne was Meyer Lansky. Excluded from the Italian mafia because he was Jewish, Lansky was now calling the shots in New York anyway, as Luciano's right-hand man. But just as Lansky had reached this pinnacle, his triumph was cut short. In 1933, Prohibition ended, and with it the stream of cash that bootlegging had delivered to the mob. And an even greater setback for Lansky came in 1936, when Lucky Luciano was found guilty of running prostitution rings in Manhattan. Lucky was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison.
When Luciano was put away, the New York police authorities mentioned 6 people that they thought might take over, and Lansky, whose name was misspelt, was mentioned.
Lansky was smart enough to say to his friend Ben Siegel, "You and I are going to be next."
Siegel headed west to Hollywood. Lansky headed south to scout out gambling opportunities in new and fertile terrain, Florida. What Lansky wanted was a location to set up his next generation of gambling houses, and he fixed his eye on a beach town just across the county line from Miami, the village of Hallandale. Officials there were especially forgiving of illegal betting. Well-run casinos would draw the tourists. The only problem, these games were already controlled by a local gangster. Lansky was going to need help muscling in, but he was having trouble recruiting new thugs from his old neighborhoods.
The era of the young, tough guy Jewish gunman is coming to an end. These young Jewish boys now are now going to be looking to go to law school, to go to medical school. So at that point you can see that every enterprise that he gets involved in, he's got to have an Italian partner.
The key partner was Vincent Alo, better known as Jimmy Blue Eyes. Alo made the Hallandale gambling impresarios an offer they couldn't refuse. He told them that whether they liked it or not, Meyer Lansky was taking over. Lansky built 3 casinos and put his brother Jake Lansky in charge. Then he smoothed all the ruffled feathers.
Anything that could be paid off with money, Meyer did not fear, because as long as you could pay off somebody or pay something somehow, that was satisfied him.
For a start, Lansky paid every single family in town $35 a week to tolerate the casinos and to stay away from them. At the time, Joseph Varon was the Hallandale city attorney. He too benefited from Meyer Lansky's generosity.
I'd go to a gambling joint, Saturday night so I'd play a little bit, and they see that whether I won or not, they'd give me a stack of chips.
Florida gambling boomed. Lansky maintained his Saratoga tradition of spectacular shows and top-quality food.
They were places that were patronized by the finest people and had seating capacity, some of them as high as 800 people. And some of the finest people of the United States patronized these places.
The trademark Lansky honesty brought in high rollers from all over the country.
And the $100 bills were that high. Oh, it was just incredible. I knew one fellow by the name of Joe Milstein. 1 week, Joe Milstein lost $800,000, all in cash. Now, that's just one player. The house extracts a certain amount of every play, and as a result, their take was monumental.
Did I enjoy it? I'm sure it was profitable, too.
Profitable because Lansky and his partners were extracting millions in illegal earnings out of casinos protected by the New York Mafia. But as Lansky was making his mark in the tropics, a shadow was looming over the rest of the world. The rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany was a painful reminder for the Russian-born Jew of his family's struggle with oppression. On his trips to New York, Lansky began to sniff out rallies of Nazi sympathizers like the German-American Bund. Then he would show up with a truckload of goons and break up the rally. But his big chance to be a part of the war effort came when Navy intelligence decided to join forces with the mob to keep the New York docks clear of Nazi saboteurs. The Navy knew that the Sicilian Mafia controlled the waterfront and figured that even in prison, Meyer's pal Lucky Luciano still controlled the Sicilians. Only one man could take the Navy's request to Luciano, Meyer Lansky. "I'll help you," the little man told the Navy brass. "It's patriotism." Over the next year, Lansky met with Lucky in prison a dozen times. And in fact, there was no sabotage on the waterfront. More importantly, Lansky used the meetings to solidify his connections with the Italian mob. After the war, Lansky took his second eldest son, Paul, on a cross-country drive to Las Vegas. The purpose of the trip? To keep tabs on the man Paul knew as Uncle Ben, Bugsy Siegel.
I think my grandfather knew, with the other partners involved with Ben, that he had to keep a real close visual eye on Ben to make sure that his nature, not his intelligence, but his nature didn't kind of stray. Because let's face it, he'd like to have a good time, and sometimes that gets in the way of business.
It had always been Meyer who kept Bugsy under control, and Bugsy was way out of control now. With mafia money, Siegel was trying to make Las Vegas a gambling mecca on the same scale as Florida, starting with the construction of the luxurious Flamingo Hotel. But cost overruns were draining the mafia's money. Bugsy was running the Flamingo into the ground before it even opened. Only months after Lansky's visit, Siegel was shot to death in Los Angeles.
That could not be done without Meyer Lansky being aware of it. He had to at least reluctantly nod his head.
Lansky always denied signing off on Siegel's murder. "I loved him," he was to say later, "and as long as he listened to me, he stayed out of trouble." Benny Siegel was dead. Lucky Luciano was also gone, released from prison and deported to Italy. Meyer Lansky was the last of his New York threesome left standing in America, and he had only begun his rise to the top as the mob's foremost tycoon. By the late 1940s, Meyer Lansky had consolidated his Florida gambling empire. He was making millions from the tourists who gambled at his glamorous casinos near Miami. And he was sending millions north to his partners in the New York Mafia, who provided the muscle to back him up. But there was one partner he could not manage, his wife, Anne. The couple now had 3 children, Buddy the eldest, Paul, and a daughter, Sandra. Lansky, always on the move between his Florida casinos and his New York headquarters, wasn't around much. Anne Lansky, forced to manage the family almost on her own, had not been up to the strain. Anne divorced Meyer in 1947. Soon afterwards, she was placed in a mental hospital.
She would just sit in a corner in a little room in New York City and maybe recognize you, maybe not. You know, just has no conception of time. You know, you haven't seen her for 10 years, you go knock on the door, she might tell you to leave. Come back later.
After the divorce, Meyer made a greater effort to play family man. He was especially concerned that his disabled son Buddy make new friends, so Meyer enlisted the help of a hospital volunteer who'd met Buddy during physical therapy sessions, Vincent Mercurio. Lansky himself soon took a liking to Mercurio and offered him bits of advice when the threesome went out for ball games.
"Do you gamble?" He asked me. I says, "No." He said, "And never start." He said, "Because you're always going to lose." And I trusted his judgment because, I mean, you're talking to the guy that's on the top of this, and he knew what the percentages were.
When asked by friends, Lansky would reluctantly recommend only one casino game.
Blackjack. He said, because you have a 17.5% chance of winning. He said, but the others are all sucker games.
In 1948, Lansky's games hit a snag. Americans were turning against gambling. Towns like Hallandale withdrew their support. One by one, Lansky's casinos were shut. But Lansky could ride out the crisis. He had stashed millions away. And for once, Lansky's family life seemed to be going well. His son Paul had even been accepted by West Point.
Extremely proud of that. That's like playing ball for Notre Dame to my grandfather. You know, your kid is there. Your son made it.
And in 1948, Lansky got married for the second time to a manicurist he'd met in Florida, Teddy Schwartz. But when Lansky arrived home from his honeymoon in Europe, there was unpleasant news. U.S. Senator Estes Kefauver had brought his traveling investigation of organized crime to New York. Lansky learned that Vincent Mercurio, staying with Buddy at the Lanskys' New York home, had accepted Meyer's subpoena at the door.
He said, "That's great." He says, "Did Vince open the telegram? Tell him to go for me." So I met him, and he says, "You want to go down for me instead?" I says, "No, thank you." He says, "Why?" I says, "I don't know what to say." He just sit there and say yes and no.
Which is exactly what Lansky did. He pled the fifth. But the hearings were televised, and for the first